Welcome to the Western Ohio PBIS Network podcast. My name is Brandy Stiegel. You are watching video 4 of the 7-part video series that's going to focus on helping your Tier 2 PBIS leadership team establish that Tier 2 PBIS implementation and interventions and supports. After watching this video, you will understand how to develop an efficient and effective process for gathering and reviewing relevant student data. You will understand how to use student data to select function-based interventions that match the needs of students. You will understand how to explain the importance of monitoring student response to an intervention. You will understand and be able to describe why baseline data should be collected and understand examples of data that can be reviewed to determine baseline levels of performance. You will be able to understand how to establish a method for collecting and graphing student data. You will understand and be able to identify key elements within graph data, such as the current level of performance, desired level of performance, and trend lines. You will be able to interpret student response to intervention and make decisions based on that data. You will establish procedures for generalization and maintenance. And then you will understand how to develop a method to access and review social validity of those interventions. And then you will also understand how to evaluate program outcomes. So let's go ahead and jump in. So as you all know from your training, PBIS is grounded in applied behavior analysis, which is also called the science of behavior. The science of behavior focuses on making changes to the environment that will lead to changes in student behavior. We know the term prevention is the act of stopping something from happening. If we can predict a problem might occur, then we can prevent those problems from happening. Prevention strategy should be the foundation of all school-wide PBIS implementations. Prevention strategy should be used regardless of whether the focus is on those Tier 1 universal supports, those Tier 2 targeted small group supports, or those Tier 3 individualized supports. So in order to truly understand the science of behavior, you must first have an understanding of the ABCs of behavior. The predictable nature of behavior can be described in an ABC format. A stands for the antecedents. Antecedents are events that occur immediately before and trigger the behavior. An antecedent can include the physical setting, the time of day, the materials, the people that are present, as well as how and what directions are given. So as I said, antecedents are going to produce the behaviors that follow. When teachers and staff ensure a well-managed classroom setting or a learning environment, when they provide appropriate materials, when they establish clear expectations and give specific directions, they can increase the likelihood of expected student behavior occurring. Now, the B in the ABC format stands for behavior. So behavior is simply what someone does. Behavior is some sort of action that can be positive or negative. Behaviors occur in response to some sort of antecedent condition. So the antecedent condition that occurs before a behavior is going to serve to make a behavior more or less likely to occur. So certain antecedent conditions can make a behavior more or less likely to occur. The C in the ABC format stands for consequences. Now, consequences are just those resulting events or outcomes that occur immediately following the student's behavior. So consequences, as we know, can be positive as well as consequences can be negative. In the classroom, consequences includes the reaction of the teacher, the reaction of their peers. It includes the specific positive feedback or the corrective feedback that a teacher will give to a student. So consequences may increase, maintain, or decrease the likelihood of a future behavior occurring. So let's look a little bit closely and look at some examples of antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. So in this case, in this scenario, the antecedent is, as the whole group prepares to debrief after the chemistry experiment, the teacher reminds everyone that the agreed procedure is to raise their hands to indicate they wish to speak. Then the teacher asks, "What was your most surprising finding today?" So the teacher The antecedent in this case is the teacher gives a pre-correct to let the students know what she expects, the behavior that she expects to follow. The behavior in this case is that some students began talking out loud. Most students raise a hand to share a finding. Nicole is one of those students that raises her hand. So the behavior that followed that pre-correct is most students did raise their hand to speak. Now, the consequences for the behavior, in this case, the teacher ignores the students who are talking out. So the consequences of those students who were talking is a planned ignoring. The teacher calls on Nicole to share her surprise finding. She follows up asking probing follow-up questions to help Nicole and the other students apply the underlying scientific concepts to their observations. So the teacher, the consequence and the positive consequence was that Nicole was able to share the teacher called on Nicole because Nicole demonstrated the behavior. And now Nicole is able to connect that positive consequence with her behavior, and it will make it more likely that she will raise her hand in the future when she's asked. So, function based thinking focuses on changing behavior based on the functions of behavior. Function based thinking focuses on why the student does the behavior versus what that behavior looks like or what that behavior sounds like. It's important to know why the behavior is occurring. This is called the function of the behavior. The function of behavior falls into two large categories. One function of a behavior is to get something or to get someone or attention from someone. The other function of behavior is to avoid something or to escape something or someone. We often apply function based thinking when a child exhibits frequent or severe behavior problems. However, thinking about what all students or small groups of students are seeking to gain or seeking to avoid can give teachers and those PBIS teams insight into the interventions that will help them meet the needs of all of their students. So, behavior is a form of communication. Unfortunately, some students, some children have learned that unexpected or inappropriate behavior is the most effective way for them to communicate what they need. So, when a student is repeatedly engaging in problem behavior, they're most likely doing this because the behavior is functional and serves as a purpose for the student to either avoid something or get something, to escape something or to seek some attention, whatever that function of behavior may be. The student has learned through repeated experience that under specific antecedent conditions, engaging in a particular behavior will reliably result in a particular consequences or outcomes. If we can identify the conditions under which problem behaviors are likely to occur, we can attempt and work to arrange environments in ways that are going to reduce the occurrences of those problems behaviors and teach and encourage positive behaviors that are going to be those replacement behaviors that are going to replace those inappropriate behaviors. The goal of function based thinking is to examine and identify patterns within that student's behavior to identify that function of that behavior. Functional behavior assessments can be used to identify the function of a student's behavior. So let's talk about how we connect functional behavior assessments to school-wide PBIS. So, years ago, researchers at the University of Oregon realized that the methods that were being used to administer functional behavior assessments to students could be applied to school wide behavior. We could use that thinking to help us understand how to approach school wide behavior. So, that correlation that those researchers made became what we know today as PBIS. PBIS teams should use function based thinking to proactively plan for and implement a school wide PBIS framework that focuses on and emphasizes fidelity, consistency, and equity. When PBIS teams understand what the majority of the students are seeking to obtain or seeking to avoid, that team can leverage naturally occurring or planned consequences to increase the likelihood that those students will demonstrate expected behaviors and decrease the probability that they will continue to demonstrate unexpected or inappropriate behaviors. Now, when introducing the ABCs of behaviors, there may be some teachers who will express some concerns that will maybe object or may have some hesitation. There may be some teachers who do not believe in giving those prompts, that positive feedbacks, or those tangible rewards, or whatever you're using for your acknowledgement system for students that are performing those expected behaviors, because they believe that students should already know what to do and they should be able to do that on their own. Then there are some teachers that are going to fear that providing that external motivation in the form of antecedents or consequential supports will undermine that student's intrinsic motivation. It's very important that that PBIS team plan professional development for teachers that's going to help focus on providing them with understanding the fundamental principles of the motivations of behavior and the difference between motivation and regulation. Understanding the role of human motivation is going to help that PBIS team plan and establish acknowledgement systems that are going to create those environments which increase the likelihood that teachers and students will demonstrate expected behaviors. Initially, when we're first beginning to implement these PBIS implementations, those interventions and supports, teachers and staff will be providing those external and extrinsic motivation for students by establishing common definitions of expected behaviors, providing antecedent supports through pre-corrects or whatever antecedent strategies they'll be using, and delivering reinforcing consequences, or delivering consequences that are going to discourage that behavior. Initially, these external motivation strategies will be used to teach all students the expected behaviors and facilitate consistent use of those expected behaviors. The goal of every PBIS implementation should be assisting students in developing self-management or internal regulation. So those strategies that that PBIS team, those interventions and supports that that PBIS team that they put in place are going to help the students develop those self-management and those self-regulation skills. So we all know that in order to become successful adults, children must learn self-regulation. So self-regulation just means that children demonstrate a behavior without being prompted, without needing affirmation or recognition. Human motivation can be classified in three ways. A motivation means that there is a lack of motivation to do something, or there is a perceived lack of ability or competence to do something. Extrinsic motivation means that an individual does something in order to obtain a particular outcome. Intrinsic motivation means that someone is participating in an activity simply for the enjoyment of the activity itself. So let's apply this concept of the human motivation continuum to a real world example that we all struggle with and that we all know about. So for this scenario, we will use eating habits. When someone is unmotivated to eat healthy, they either don't see the need to eat healthy, or they don't believe they understand how to eat healthy. They don't understand how to maintain a healthy diet. So they believe that they don't have the competence to do so. When someone is extrinsically motivated to eat healthy, their motivation could be based on several associated processes. An individual could be motivated to eat healthy out of compliance. In this case, the motivation is external. The individual could be motivated by a desire to meet a certain BMI, to lower their blood pressure, or other goals for their workplace health insurance or their biometric screenings, or whatever purpose that an employer may have, or someone external may have. An individual could also be motivated to eat healthy because of a desire for approval from self or for others. So the individual could be motivated by the desire to fit in, where in a group of friends where everyone eats healthy. They could also be motivated by wanting to look good based on societal standards, based on social media standards. In this case, the motivation is somewhat external. An individual could also be motivated to eat healthy because of a self-endorsement of goals they've set for themselves, for myself. So same for me. I am a planning and set goals to make sure that I work out every day for at least 60 minutes. I get 10,000 steps. In this case, the individual is motivated by a desire to be healthier. The motivation in this case is somewhat internal. So, lastly, an individual could be motivated to eat healthy because of the synthesis of goals. The individual decides to choose a vegan diet as a part of a commitment to sustaining and improving the environment because they want to be more of a better steward of the environment. And so, in this case, the motivation is internal. When someone is intrinsically motivated, to eat healthy, they do so because they enjoy doing so. They have an inherent love for healthy foods. They are internally motivated to be healthy. So, because most human behavior relies on some form of external motivation, as some students move past early childhood, many educators face the challenge of teaching students to identify value and engage in those socially expected and appropriate behaviors with minimal external pressure or regulation. So, the self determination theory identifies three needs individuals must fulfill to behave with intrinsic motivation. So, they may need competence, which means succeeding in what is to be done, belief in one's ability to succeed, and self efficacy. They need relatedness, being able to connect with others and belonging. And they are going to need autonomy, which is being in control of one's life or self determination. Students may not find behaviors critical to school success inherently interesting or personally valuable. Therefore, teachers and support staff will need to provide some level of instruction and reinforcement to encourage students to engage in expected behaviors. Over time, students will begin to self regulate engagement in appropriate behaviors because doing so increases their feelings of connectedness and experiences of competency and autonomy. PBIS implementations are going to support the development of self regulation by creating environments where all students feel welcome, where all students feel connected, where all students feel valued. Directly teaching, monitoring, and reinforcing those school wide expectations assist students in the development of those self monitoring and self regulation skills. Students who are learning a new skill or behavior may need external regulation in the form of positive, specific feedback and or a tangible reinforcement to gain enough exposure to those naturally occurring positive consequences of the behavior to help make sure that that behavior happens again. So, for example, when a student uses pro-social behavior such as they're taking turns, they're saying please or thank you, and keeping their hands to themselves, it allows the student struggling to find friends to experience that naturally occurring positive consequence of social acceptance from their peers or their friends. The amount of external regulation or motivation necessary for those students to consistently display expected behavior is going to depend on several things. It's going to depend on their age and their development level. It's going to depend on the student's prior knowledge of the expected behavior and their experience with those expected behaviors. It's going to depend on the context or the setting of the events. It's going to depend on the student's understanding that the school-wide behavioral rules and expectations and all of those procedures and rules that adults are asking them to follow and learn will increase their overall success in the classroom It will increase their success in school and eventually in life outside of the school. So when we teach expected behaviors explicitly, when we consistently reinforce those expected behaviors, over time, that skill would become self-initiated and self-regulated. So when students are given the opportunity to constantly practice the new behavior skill, the student will be able to apply that skill in multiple settings, as well as experience those naturally occurring positive consequences of their access to their desired peer groups, because they're learning to be successful within the community. The goal of all PBIS implementations is to teach the students those pro-social behaviors that's going to help them learn self-regulation skills. So let's talk about selecting function-based interventions. So several things to keep in mind. Tier 2 interventions should be based on the function of the student's behavior. Failure to base an intervention on the specific function or purpose it serves is going to result in ineffective and unnecessarily restrictive procedures. It's not going to work if it's not based on the function. When teams learn to recognize repeated patterns of behaviors and interactions within the environment, that's going to be key for implementing successful interventions. So the Tier 2 team should develop a process for gathering student data that provides relevant information in order to determine the function of that behavior. So what we're going to do is now we're going to walk through the Tier 2 Adapted Functional Assessment Checklist for teachers and staff. And this is a document that was created by the state of Missouri, their PBIS, their statewide PBIS planning team. So the Tier 2 Adapted Functional Checklist for teachers and staff, we also call that FACTS Part A, is a tool that can be used by Tier 2 teams to collect and organize information in order to determine the function of a behavior. Again, the function of a behavior is key to selecting the correct intervention for each student. The Tier 2 team will identify the possible function of the behavior by one, identifying the problem behavior. Next, they will collect and analyze student information. So they'll do a record review. They will complete a context analysis to determine when the behavior does or does not occur. And then 4, they will complete a behavior pathway. And so we're going to walk through all of those steps. So in order to gather the information for the Tier 2 FACTS Part A in an efficient manner, a consistent data collection procedure must be developed by that Tier 2 team. Tier 2 teams must decide what team members will collect and record the information for the records review, which team members will meet with the teachers to gather information for the context analysis. There are 5 sections to the Tier 2 Adapted FACTS Part A, and we're going to go over those. So the first section of the FACTS Part A, the FACTS is, like I said, a tool that can be used by the Tier 2 team to collect and organize information in order to determine the function of a behavior. So again, the Tier 2 team is going to follow the following steps. They're going to identify the problem behavior. They're going to begin collecting and analyzing student information, doing a record review, going in and looking at various records. And then they're going to complete a context analysis to determine when the behavior does or does not occur. And then they're going to complete a behavior pathway. I'll drop a link in the chat box for a copy of this FACTS document. So section 1 of the FACTS is going to have the team complete this section. So the first thing they're going to do is check the enrollment date and attendance date to determine if the student has had access to school-wide and classroom instruction. Have they been taught explicitly those Tier 1 universal expectations? And again, we remember that everything in your Tier 2 program hinges on the expectation and the understanding that the child is still receiving instruction or has had instruction in those Tier 1 expectations, rules, and procedures. So then the team is going to interview the student and the teachers to determine if the students had access to school-wide and classroom recognition. So as you see in this portion, it says, did the student receive weekly instruction on school-wide and classroom expectations and rules? So the answer in this case, if the answer is yes, the next question is, did the student receive recognition recently for following school-wide and classroom expectations? So are they receiving acknowledgments? If they are, then that person will put yes. If no, then that team is going to be advised to go back and review the implementation of effective classroom practices with the teacher, because we don't know if that child needs tier 2 interventions, because we don't have any evidence that they are being supported with those effective classroom practices and that they are being supported with those tier 1 school-wide universal supports. So the next section is going to look at the description of strengths and problem behaviors. All right, so the first thing is going to, the team is going to be asked is to describe academic and social and behavioral strengths of the student. The next thing is they're going to record the general description of the problem behavior, identified from that identification process, such as ODRs and minors, and what caused the trigger for that student to be nominated or identified. And then they're going to record observable student actions. So as you can see in the example here, it says section 2, descriptions of strengths and problem behavior. So describe the student's strengths, academic and behavioral. So in this case, Jill comes to class prepared and follows rules and directions in classes that are more activity-based, such as arts, PE. Again, this is going to require that teachers and staff have an understanding of who they're serving. We should all be able to find a strength, no matter what type of behavior that child is displaying. Everyone has a strength. So then this first section is going to be problem behavior. So they're going to be looking at those office discipline referrals or those classroom logs. What are the behaviors that child is displaying? In this case, it's non-compliance and defiance. And then they're going to record observable notes on what does non-compliance look like? What does defiance? What does that behavior or that problem behavior actually look like? So in this case, Jill is taps, makes noise when the whole class can hear. Jill blacks out tests and other papers with the marker. So the next section is going to be a records review, section 3. So when reviewing existing data for all students identified for tier 2 supports, it is important to review academic data to determine if additional academic supports are needed. So if students are identified as at risk by the tier 2 team and they have academic concerns or issues, these concerns should be addressed through academic supports in addition to any behavioral interventions provided. So we should be ensuring that if we find that there is a problem academically and with behavior, that they should be receiving those multi-tier systems of supports. So for example, if a student is engaging in some kind of low-level acting out behaviors in the classroom to escape a difficult academic task or a difficult assignment, simply placing that child in a behavioral intervention will not solve the underlying academic deficit or the problem. So in addition to those behavioral interventions and supports, academic supports have to be provided. So during this records review, now fast forward to doing this record review, we're now going to be beginning to collect information about that student. We're going to be going through data to see what story that data can tell us. So the first step is to record the name of each piece of information to be collected on each student in the first column. This should be standard for each student. So we want to decide as a team what artifacts we're going to use, and we want to be consistent when we're making this, when we're looking at all of the students that we are considering. So the second thing is going to be recording, the team is going to record the date the information was collected in this middle column. So in this case, you see it was collected on January 7th. And then the third column, they're going to do a summary of the information from each source is recorded in this third column. So this summary includes relevant dates, dates of referrals, dates assessments were given. So we want to be as specific as possible when we're summarizing this findings. We want to talk about the number of referrals. We want to talk about what was happening in the classroom. We want to look at the attendance, the tardies, whatever information that the team decides to collect. Remember, it should be consistent for all students. So if we're going to decide that we're collecting office discipline referrals, minors, absences, tardies, GPA, and all of that, it needs to be the consistent. And we need to be able to summarize our findings in that third column. So section 4 is going to be the understanding, doing that context analysis of social behavioral performance. So the first thing the team is going to do is identify that student schedule. So they're going to list the times that define the student schedule. So what their daily schedule is. If they're on a bail schedule, each bail should be listed here. If they're in a self-contained classroom, the schedule within that classroom should be listed. So they're going to have to interview the students' teachers to identify the type of activity that most often occurs during each time during that subject. They're then going to talk to that student's teacher to identify the problem behavior that's displayed during each time period and the activity and the likelihood that that problem is going to occur. So then they're going to also talk during that interview with that teacher to identify the most frequent adult and peer response to the problem behavior. If the likelihood rating indicates that the behavior is occurring daily or multiple times a day. So in this case, you can see the first column is going to list the student schedule. The second column is going to list what exactly that they do in that schedule. So in this case, the students in reading, they go to whole group, small group, and then they have their test. Then they go to art, PE, music, science, lunch, recess. And then we're also, again, listing what type of activity, whether it's a large group, small group, independent activity, it's a transition, or if it's an unstructured activity. So then we're going to have that teacher indicate the probability of that behavior occurring. So 1 meaning a low likelihood of that behavior occurring during that particular time or activity, or 6 meaning that there is a high probability. So they're going to use it on that Likert scale of a 1 to 6. Then in this last column, we're going to talk about, they're going to document what their response, which of those effective classroom-based practices are they using to respond to the behavior. So what they're looking at in this case is what's the response? What is it that the teacher is going to do in response to that behavior? And again, this is going to help us know if that teacher is implementing those effective classroom practices, such as providing pre-corrects, reteaching, redirects, prompting, all of those things. We're trying to see if the teacher, what consequences that the teacher is providing. So section 5 is going to be the behavior pathway. So using the information gathered from the description of the problem behavior and the context analysis, the PBIS Tier 2 team will then look for trends in order to complete this section. So they're going to look, when does the problem behavior most frequently occur? During what activity does the problem behavior most often occur? They're going to be looking for patterns and the consequences that occur after the problem behavior. And then they're going to determine if the student is seeking to obtain or avoid something. So then they're going to identify the function of that behavior. So in this case, Jill, during the morning, work, reading, spelling, math, and homework time. This is when given independent work activities, the student will make noises, whole class can hear it, blackout tests, other papers with markers. Because of this, the teacher will redirect or provide extra assistance. So they have identified that the function of Jill's behavior, therefore the function is to obtain something. So we have identified during which activities are we seeing these behaviors, what are the activities that they're supposed to, what subjects we're seeing most of these behaviors, what activities during this time are the students most likely to be doing, and then what is that student supposed to be doing, and what problem and how does a teacher respond, and based on that we can tell that function of the behavior. So really we're walking through doing an investigation to understand why a particular behavior is occurring. So, part of the student identification process, again, as we said, is going to be that tier two team has a process in place to identify students and then to collect that data to determine the function of the behavior. Okay, so here's a quick flow chart. And again, I obtained this from the Missouri PBIS website. And it says, did the student receive instruction on school-wide and classroom expectation rules and procedures? Did the student receive recognition recently for following school-wide and classroom expectations and procedures? Again, remember, the first thing we do before we decide that a child is in need of tier two intervention is ensure that that student has had and is still receiving the full supports in the school-wide universal tier one implementation. If not, we have no idea if that student truly needs these tier two interventions. So again, that team has already established a process for identifying students, whether that be through the nominations from a peer, a parent, or a teacher or a staff member. They could be using their data collection process. We're looking at students that have a certain number of office discipline referrals, or they maybe have deemed at risk because of academic failure, tardiness, attendance, or whatever. Or they could have identified those students using those universal screeners, which we talked about in previous videos. After they have that student's been nominated, that team is going to work with that teacher, the child's teacher or teachers to collect data using that adapted facts document. They're going to clarify the target problem and the behavior in observable, measurable terms. They're going to collect and compile that student data and complete a context analysis to determine what is maintaining the problem and where it is most and least likely to occur. Based on that data, they are going to determine the function of the behavior, what conditions are more likely to lead to the problem behavior, what response reliably follows that problem behavior. So we know that the functions of the behavior can be we're going to identify is the function to obtain attention or an item or an activity. So that could mean to get attention from adults and or their peers, to get a tangible, an object, event, or some activity they want to have, or to get sensory stimulation, some type of visual, auditory, or kinesthetic thing. Or we're going to determine if that behavior or the function of that behavior is to escape, avoid attention, or a task or activity. So is the behavior to avoid and escape attention from adults or peers, to avoid or escape a tangible, demanding, that could be a demanding or a boring task that they deem boring, a task that they deem boring, or a setting or an activity that they don't want to do or go to, or to avoid escape from sensory stimulation that is painful or discomforting. So when looking at those functions, those different interventions that you are attempting to put in place for your tier two supports, you want to make sure that those interventions that you put in place match the function of behavior. In this graphic, you'll see several evidence-based interventions as you see across the top. So we have check-in, check-out, social skill groups, intervention groups, self-monitoring, check and connect, first step, next, academic intervention. And again, this is not the exhaustive list of intervention. There are other interventions. Again, you always want to make sure that the intervention is research-based, that there is some research to show that this intervention works with a particular function and that the intervention has some data to back it up. So as we can see, that check-in, check-out works very well for students who are trying to get adult attention. And in another video, we'll talk about the check-in, check-out. Social skill groups, intervention groups, They work with all types of functions of behavior, whether it's to get adult attention, get peer attention, avoid adult attention, avoid peer attention, avoid tasks, or access to activities or tangibles. The same thing with self-monitoring. This works. This is an effective intervention based on regardless of what the function of behavior is. Check and connect is an intervention. It works best when the function of that behavior is to avoid adult attention, to avoid peer attention, or to avoid task. And then first step next is great for kids that are looking for attention from adults or from peers. And then academic intervention works when the function of the behavior is to get attention. So again, as I said, it's very important to match that that function of that behavior, that intervention rather, to that function of behavior. And so teams are going to really want to research whatever intervention that they are putting in place to make sure they understand which students or which functions it best supports. So now let's go ahead and talk about how we monitor how these interventions are working for our students. So data that is collected when monitoring a student's response to an intervention should answer the question, is this intervention effective? Data on the student's response to that intervention should be collected at least weekly. That data that is graphed can easily be reviewed by that tier 2 team and used for making decisions to continue the intervention as planned, to check fidelity of the intervention implementation, to determine if the intervention needs to be intensified, or can that intervention, that team begin fading those intervention components. So it's very important that that team puts in place a process for monitoring the student's response to that intervention. So just like with academic data, we should always begin with baseline data. We always need to know where we are starting at. So baseline data is the measuring stick by which intervention data is going to be compared to determine if there is a change in the behavior, if this is working. So baseline data is also going to be used to set goals for the student's performance within those behavioral interventions. Various sources can be used for baseline data. You can use the number of office discipline referrals. You can use the records, those classroom logs of minor behavior problems that happened in the classroom that may not have resulted in an office discipline referral. You can look at attendance. You can use those universal screeners and interviews conducted with those who have observed that student's behavior. So again, we just want to get a baseline idea of where those students are beginning at. So when we think about this, it's very important that when tracking students, that there is a method put in place to graph that data. Again, there are certain programs, school-wide information systems or information systems that can be used to help you do this, but this can also be done paper and pencil. So baseline data should be graphed with a vertical line at the end of the phase to indicate when the intervention data begins. This vertical line right here. The student's behavioral goal should be at a level that's challenging to the student, but one they can achieve within the first few days. And then the baseline data should be the same data that will be used to monitor progress. So as you can see here, this data is they're tracking the student's performance daily using the daily progress reports. They have a vertical line to give us an idea of when that intervention is actually beginning. The information before this vertical line is going to be that baseline data. We set a goal of a student receiving 80% of their daily points. And then that's going to be our goal. So we have a goal line, and then we're going to be able to, as we are monitoring this progress, look at the trend line, meaning we're looking at how well the student is progressing towards that goal, and if they're meeting the goal, if they're not meeting the goal, or whatnot. So let's talk a little bit about intervention data. So after data collection and graphing methods have been established, the student data should regularly be reviewed to monitor progress and determine each participant's response to the intervention. Important features to examine with each student graph include the student's level of performance, okay? So the student's level of performance is entered each day from those daily progress reports, or it's summarized weekly. Again, it depends on what that process that team decides. Performance is indicated by percentage of daily progress report points earned. So that daily progress report, which we'll talk about in the next video, is going to let that team know if that student is responding to those interventions. The second thing it should include is the desired level of performance. The desired level of performance is determined by the student's behavioral goal. So in the case that we looked at just a second ago, it was 80%. The tier 2 team will determine initial goal using that baseline data. And then the third thing to consider is the trend line. The trend line is a line that is going to be drawn through a series of data points to represent the student's actual rate and level of progress. The rate of progress is going to refer to how long it will take the student to reach the goal line. So we're just mapping their progress and ensuring that our trends are going in the correct direction. So it is suggested that students participate in the intervention and that the tier 2 team collect data for at least 2 to 3 weeks before making a decision about how well that student's responding to the intervention. It's recommended to generate at least 8 data points within 3 weeks of instruction before making a decision about whether or not an intervention change is needed. Each time the student data is reviewed, an interpretation of the data should be done to determine if that student is having a positive response to the intervention, a questionable response to the intervention, or a poor response to the intervention. Decisions about what occurs next will need to be made based on that review of that data. The tier 2 team will make decisions that include continuing the intervention or intensifying the intervention, modifying the intervention, or fading the intervention, or even returning to the problem solving phase to gather some additional information that may have been missed. In every case, decisions about the next phase of intervention should be made based on the interpretation of that student's data that they're collecting. So now let's go a little deeper into these responses to intervention. So let's talk about what a positive response to an intervention means. So if data indicates that the student is making progress towards his or her goal and will reach that goal within a reasonable amount of time, the team should determine how long the student is expected to maintain that success before intervention components are removed. So before any decisions are made, the team must first examine and evaluate the fidelity of the implementations, where all of those components of that intervention deliver consistently and accurately. So in order to ensure that the response is due to the students not actually responding versus it being the response due to the intervention not being implemented with fidelity. So a positive response to an intervention means the gap between the trend line and the goal line is closing at an acceptable rate. So we're going upward. All right, we're having positive. Our numbers are trending upwards. All right, so when a student is having the data shows that the student is having a positive response to that intervention, the team can one continue the intervention with the current goal and continue to see how well they are going to maintain that success. They can continue the intervention and increase the goal. So we were at an 80%, we may move to an 85% goal of daily progress report points that we get. Then the teacher's going to also, the team or that intervention facilitator is going to want to begin to teach self-management skills and begin fading intervention components to determine if the student has acquired functional independence, meaning are they going to continue to use those interventions that they are apply those skills that they're learning in the intervention. So, i.e., the student continues successful behavior performance with less teacher feedback. So we're going to either continue the intervention with the current goal, increase the goal, or the intervention coordinator is going to begin to teach those self-management skills and fade some of those intervention supports to see if the students can continue to demonstrate and maintain that behavior. Before deciding to teach self-management skills or anything like that, that student should demonstrate a positive response. So we don't want to go in and try to push those skills in um, prior to that. That tier two team is going to establish what they decide as the criteria for success. As a general guideline, students should have 4 consecutive weeks with 4 more data daily points that are higher, that they've met their goal at 80% or higher before they begin doing any of the fading or self-management teaching instruction. All right, so now let's move on to when a student has a questionable response. So when the distance between the student's trend line and the goal line is closing, but that closing is occurring at an unacceptable rate, the student's response to that intervention is going to be viewed as questionable. So when data indicates a questionable response to intervention, the first thing that team is going to want to do is examine and evaluate the fidelity of the implementation. They're going to want to know were all the components of the intervention delivered consistently and accurately. This can include doing some common fidelity checks, including observing, using a checklist to observe the intervention facilitator delivering that intervention, or even having a self-report of the intervention, having that person complete a self-check checklist to understand if they are implementing with fidelity. But the goal, if they are not seeing that, if they're having that questionable response, they're not trending at an acceptable rate. The goal is to ensure that that intervention is being delivered with fidelity. So, if that team is satisfied that the intervention has been implemented with fidelity, then the team may decide to modify or intensify the intervention. Techniques to modify or intensify will be discussed within each intervention, but some general rules can be applied to the intervention. So the first thing they want to do is reconsider the intervention. Ensure that the correct function was identified, making sure to go back to their facts and make sure that they have identified the correct function of the behavior, and confirm the intervention aligns with that function that they have identified. So they want to review all the features of the implemented intervention to determine that it's in alignment with that function of the behavior. The next thing the team can do is reconsider the goal. This means that they're going to review that initial goal to ensure that it was properly established based on that student's baseline data, meaning was the goal a little too, was it unachievable? Was it something that was a little too challenging? They are going to then review that student's currently daily percentages and adjust that goal as appropriate to ensure that that student is able to experience some success. As that student is achieving success, then they can go back and increase that goal. So the third thing they can do is provide more frequent feedback. So in this case, the students are going to begin receiving additional feedback sessions with that intervention facilitator. They can allow for more frequent interactions between the students and his or her teachers. So we're going to increase the amount of feedback that we are giving those students. Another thing they can do when they see that the student's having a questionable response is they can begin to individualize the feedback procedure. So this means they can allow the student to select the adult with whom he or she will regularly meet with. They can allow the student to use alternative ways to contact the adults that will monitor his or her progress. So they can allow the students to text that adult, email that adult, have some way to choose how they're going to communicate with the adult. Another thing that they can do if the student is having a questionable response is to add in a self-monitoring component where that student is also going to begin to rate and reflect themselves. And then lastly, they can individualize the reinforcer or the positive consequence. So they can collaborate and create an individualized contract that specifies as the reinforcers or the tangibles that that student will earn. They can allow the student to select an adult with whom they will spend additional time with, or they can individualize the reinforcer based on that student's function of behavior and allowing that student to select that reinforcer. So the third type of response is a poor response. When the distance between the trend line and the goal line widens, the response to the intervention is poor. So when data indicates the student's response to intervention is poor, the first thing that team is going to want to do is look at that fidelity of the implementation. Again, we want to determine if the student is not responding to the intervention because it's just not a good fit for the student, or if the poor response is due to the implementation, the intervention not being implemented with fidelity. All right, so what do we do when we see a poor response to an intervention? So after ensuring that the intervention was implemented correctly and consistently, then the team should consider the following questions. Was the primary problem identified correctly? So do we need to go back to that facts, adaptive facts, and problem solve again? Is the intervention aligned with the student's function of behavior? So did we identify the correct function of behavior? And then are there other functions to consider? Could there possibly be other functions and behaviors that we may have not identified and may have other functions of the other functions and serve other functions? But the goal is to do the problem solving to see why that student is not responding to the intervention and make adjustments. So, a couple of things to consider after the team has addressed these considerations. More intensive individualized interventions may be warranted. When they see that a student is having poor response, teams should consider students for tier 3 supports, i.e., through a functional behavior assessment, an official, and a behavior intervention planning process when they meet the following conditions. So, one, if the data indicates the interventions were implemented with fidelity, so we've looked at the fidelity implementation checklist and we've observed that the implementation, the intervention was being implemented with fidelity. The student demonstrates persistence, non-response to the intervention, so that trend line is never catching the goal, and the goal and the performance are never catching up. And the team is reasonably confident that the modifications to the current intervention will not result in a better student response. So after those three conditions have been met, then that team can consider whether that student may need those tier 3 individualized supports. So now let's go ahead and talk about the tier 2 data review process. So what you're seeing here is a pre-meeting organizer. A pre-meeting organizer can be used to help that tier 2 team um, discuss students and decide who needs to be discussed at the next meeting. Now, remember, not every student in a tier 2 intervention will need to be discussed or reviewed at every tier 2 meeting. The names of students that are responding questionably, poorly, or eligible for fading are going to be submitted to that tier 2 team facilitator and are documented to inform the tier 2 meeting agenda. So we don't need to talk about that. So when we are someone, that facilitator, that intervention coordinator, is going to look at the data prior to the meeting, and they're going to look at the number of students participating in each intervention, the number of students with a positive response in each intervention, the number of students with a questionable response in each intervention, and then they're going to look at the number of students with a poor response in each intervention. We're just looking at the total numbers of students. So students responding positively but not eligible for being faded from that intervention can be documented in the shaded column on this form right here in this column. These are students, they're doing well, but we're not yet ready to fade them out. These students are not added to the Tier 2 agenda, as typically there is no changes needing to be made in their intervention until they're ready to be faded out of that intervention. Then in the third column, we're on the second column, we're going to be introducing the students that with a positive response. We're going to document those students that have a positive response. They're eligible for fading or graduating. So those are those students that are demonstrating that positive response and meeting decision rules, and they're ready to begin fading or graduating. And the team should have already had a process in place for what happens when those students are at that point where they're ready to be faded out of the intervention or graduated. The third column is going to document those students with those questionable responses, and then the students with the poor response. So again, here's a document from the Missouri Schoolwide PBIS. The Student Progress Monitoring Guide is a tool that was developed to provide that explicit guidance through the steps of identifying students and monitoring their progress. So this document, and I'll drop a link to that in the description box as well. So the student identification portion of this guide is used to help teams select function-based interventions to increase the likelihood that that student is going to have some success. The progress monitoring portion of this guide has a goal of directing teams to use direct observation and artifacts as clear evidence of non-response, questionable responses, or poor responses. By coming up with some type of decision-making rule, teams don't have to use this particular rule, but they should have a decision-making process in order to decide what they need to do next. Having a guided and a documented decision-making process is going to make sure teams are more likely to increase the number of students who are successfully responding to this process. So as you can see here, let me go back. We are looking at, was the implementation implemented with fidelity? If yes, and the student is having a positive response, then the team will go through the process of looking at what data was used to inform their progress. Was it daily progress reports, weekly progress reports? They'll check the social validity. Then they'll look at, did the team follow decision rules to identify and select students who will continue in the intervention? Who's going to continue with their goal? Who needs their goal increase? Who needs fading? Who needs the graduation? Then if the question is, the team is unsure if the intervention was implemented with fidelity, they're going to go back and reassess that intervention implementation. They're going to problem solve to see if there are any problems to the staff implementing that implementation. And as well, they're going to document decisions made and steps used to take and observe these interventions in their meetings. So if that answer is unsure, they cannot say, or if the answer is no. So if a student is having a questionable response, they're going to again go through the same steps as we talked about earlier just a second ago. Look at what data was used to inform progress made in the intervention. Was it daily progress report points? Was it weekly progress? Again, checking the social validity of the intervention. And then they're going to look at, did the team follow decision rules to identify the students requiring modification? Did they reconsider the function? Did they reconsider the goal? Did they provide a more frequent feedback? Did they individualize the feedback? Did they individualize the reinforcer? Now, if that student is having a poor response, then of course they're going to always check the social validity of the program. They're going to, number two, ensure that the primary problem was identified correctly and addressed on the student's daily progress report. They're going to answer, is the intervention aligned with the function of the student's behavior? Are there other functions of those behaviors that had not been considered? When the team is confident with the behavior identification, the alignment of the intervention, and the function, and that no additional function should be considered, the team should discuss maybe changing that intervention or considering the students for those tier 3 individualized interventions. So here are some guidelines for interpreting student data and making decisions. So again, the positive response means that the gap between the trend line and the goal line is closing at an acceptable rate. Some questions, some guidelines to consider. Was the intervention implemented as intended? Again, we say we can continue. If yes, then continue intervention with the current goal. You can continue intervention with the goal increase. They can begin to teach those self-management skills and eventually fade the intervention components. If that student is having that questionable response, meaning the gap between their trend line and the goal line stops widening, but closure does not occur in an acceptable amount of time. Again, the first question is, was the intervention implemented as intended? If no, that team is going to employ strategies to increase implementation integrity and fidelity. If yes, they're going to increase the intensity of a current intervention for a short period of time to assess the impact. If the rate improves and continues, if the rate does not improve, they're going to go back to the problem solving. Now, if a student's having that poor response, meaning that gap between the trend line and the goal line continues to widen with no change in rate, then again, always starting with, was the intervention implemented as intended? If no, they're going to employ strategies to increase implementation integrity. If yes, then they're going to answer, was the problem identified correctly? Is the intervention aligned with the function? And are there other functions to consider? So some things that we want to talk about to monitor the intervention outcomes. So one, the team is going to identify the number of students in the program. We want to make sure that we have the capacity and the number of facilitators to implement whatever intervention that we put in place. Another thing is, when fully implemented, check-in and check-out and other tier 2 interventions should support approximately 7 to 15% of students school-wide. If we are having more students in need of these tier 2 interventions, we want to go back and examine the fidelity of our tier 1 intervention. They want to consider the intervention success rate and effectiveness. So again, we're looking at how many students are having positive responses, how many students are having questionable, how many students are having poor responses. What is the percentage of students participating in check-in, check-out that are meeting their goals, or whatever intervention you're doing, that are meeting their goals on a regular basis? Approximately 70% of students in a check-in, check-out, which is the most widely used tier 2 intervention, should respond to the intervention. If we have less than that, we need to go back and look at the implementation integrity. Is the intervention implementation being implemented with fidelity? We keep reinforcing that. If it's not being implemented with fidelity, your data is going to not be valid, because you're collecting data and the program is not, you don't have evidence that the implementation is being implemented with fidelity. And then they're going to think about the percentage of program steps implemented weekly, implemented accurately daily, weekly, and that is used to provide supports for additional resources and professional learning. So we're looking at, we as a tier 2 team come up with some way to monitor fidelity, and we're collecting data on that and using that data to help us identify additional professional learning topics that may need to be considered. So the last thing we're going to talk about is monitoring intervention outcomes using existing school data. So some things that tier 2 team is going to need to think about is, how many students participated in the tier 2 intervention? whatever that intervention is during the school year. How many of those participants successfully completed the self-management phase and subsequently graduated from the program? Among the students who graduated, were there differences in attendance, tardies, major or minor discipline events, or grades associated with the number of school days before intervention versus during the after intervention? So are we seeing some trends, some growth? How many participants required adaptations to the standard tier 2 intervention? They were having that questionable or that poor response, and we adapted that intervention. Of the students who participated in a function-based adaptation of a tier 2 intervention, how many students successfully completed the self-management phase and then graduated? Were there students who required additional and or more intensive supports beyond the tier 2 intervention? If so, how many students and what types of supports were provided? From all students who at some point during the school year qualified to participate in that tier 2 intervention, how many were also at some point evaluated for special education eligibility? So we're going to be looking at how many students that were identified via either nomination, that universal screener, or our data review, and how many of those students were also then identified as being eligible for special education services. We're going to determine whether any specific subgroups of children were served in tier 2 interventions, whether it will be English as second language learners, socioeconomic subgroups, or racial subgroups. Was the percentage of students in subgroups or participated in tier 2 interventions proportional to the percentage of the overall student population? Again, we're looking for to ensure that there's no disproportionality in a particular subgroup being referred for tier 2 interventions. And then were those outcomes from each tier 2 intervention similar across all student groups? So were we having the same success amongst all of those subgroups that participated in these interventions? So thank you for tuning into this video. Please don't forget to hit subscribe and like the video.